I now know actually you get lots of bats there, but there we go. Another story. So this isn't a flying saucer. This is meant to be an arrow coming towards you. But the only way I could try and assess whether I'd discovered anything was I realized that when the bats are flying towards me, I get a whole series of clear, crisp calls. And then as they get loud and close, the calls get fuzzier and fuzzier because of all the echoes coming off the tamarisk. And if they're coming over my shoulder and heading the wrong way, it starts off all fuzzy, and then the calls resolve and get rather clearer. So I went through all my files and I tried to work out whether there were eastbound files or westbound files. I have to admit there's probably some degree of bias in this because you get more ultrasound out of the front end of a bat than you do out of the back end of a bat. But it's rather strange. I tried to compare. This is August, and at the top it's November. So it's a strange way round sort of graph. And the orange is the flying east, and the blue is the flying west. So earlier on, it's fairly even. By the time we get into September, and even more so later on, it's predominantly westbound. And right at the end of the migration, when we're getting to the end of October and into November, almost every pass is definitely westbound. So I felt convinced that we probably did have Nathusius Pipistrelle flying west along Chesil Beach in the autumn, heading for the West Country, no doubt. So I got my first answer. And being a curious sort of person and actually quite ignorant in this respect, I then found myself wanting to know what happened when they went back to the Baltic, because they must be going back, otherwise we'd be knee-deep in them by now. So again, I start looking at the map, trying to work out where I might be able to study this. The other thing, various other things are happening. And down at Portland Bill, this is April 2018, I've been running a bat detector at the Portland Bird Observatory here, which is surrounded by an oasis of vegetation. And behind it is a field with a shallow valley in it. And this is a route often taken by migrating birds. But Martin Cade told me that on the 7th of April, two of the bird watchers saw bats flying in over the sea from the south at 6:25 and at 11:30, just before lunch. And you think to yourself, why? Well, at that stage, we were very lucky in that we had their bat detector sitting at the back of the field. And that evening, about 40 minutes after sunset, one Nathusius Pipistrelle went past. There were only 8 other files recorded before midnight. They were all meiotis files, starting quite a lot later. And then the next night, about 40 minutes after sunset, a second Nathusius Pipistrelle passed that detector. There were only 2 other files before midnight that evening. So I think these were 2 Nathusius Pipistrelles flying in from the south across the sea. I think the one that arrived earlier was probably fit to continue its journey that next evening, but the one that arrived late probably needed a day to recuperate and set off soon after dawn the next night. So just a theory starts to develop. Maybe these bats are flying in from France and the Channel Islands in the spring. And Annie Binet of the Jersey Bat Group, I think she's now in Sussex or somewhere, she mentioned that in Jersey, Nathusius Pipistrelles are at their most common during April. So that sort of ties in. And I found a paper that looked at how fast these bats fly when on migration. And they concluded about 25 kph. Now, if you're a bat setting off in the Channel Islands, I don't think you'd set off any later than nautical dawn, which is when you can just see a battleship on the horizon. In fact, they probably wouldn't set off that late anyway. But if it did set off at nautical dawn, that bat we had at 11:30 has been flying for over 6 hours. And in that much time, it could have traveled 150 kilometers. which looks like that. So it's perfectly possible that we are getting bats that are flying across from the French coast and the Channel Islands during the spring migration. The sort of question in the back of my mind is, which bothers me slightly, is why? I thought they were trying to go east. Why would they go north? But maybe they're Northumberland-headed bats, I'm not sure. Anyway, meanwhile in the Solent, I was running 3 SM4 bats. One borrowed from Hampshire Bat Group at Hurst Castle, at Fort Victoria, and up at Gurnard. And the circles give an indication of the number of Nathusius Pipistrelle files I found. So it seems strange that there are more up near Cowes than I recorded down here. Of course, this isn't conclusive. That might just be a better place to put a bat detector, but it just raises this question as to whether the bats are coming up from the south, working their way across the island. And I was also interested when I had a look at the timing, which days, which nights these bats were coming through. On the Isle of Wight, it was centered around the 18th and 19th of April. I still was running a detector on Chesil Beach, and there I was guessing 21st of April. So it's hard to argue that the bats I got on the Isle of Wight came from Chesil Beach, further west, because I recorded the Chesil Beach ones at a later date. So there are all these little hints that maybe we've got bats coming in from the south. So how are we doing so far? I don't know if anybody wants to ask me anything at this stage. If it stays quiet, I guess I'll just press on.
That's all very interesting so far.
Okay, thank you. It's good to know that there's still somebody there.
It is strange talking to yourself, I have to admit.
Okay, so how to test the French connection. So I was looking at the where the high ground is and concluding that Dorset wasn't really helpful. If we got bats going in this direction, there are no features that are going to bring them through a narrow point all the way across to Portsmouth. But then I looked at the Isle of Wight, and the Isle of Wight's got a ridge across the middle. So the Needles, it's actually the same formation as Old Harry Rocks over here. So this is all the same bit of geology. But I was hoping that this might separate the bats from Dorset from bats coming in from the south. So maybe if I could set up detectors to try and find out whether bats are passing through these locations on the island, that would give some idea of whether the theory has wings, I suppose, in this case. So here's the plan. Here are the locations. They're all carefully chosen to try and cover particular physical features. Like this is probably the main valley, which if you're in the south of the island and we're going to the north, you'd go up this valley. But where am I going to get 10 static bat detectors? I did think about asking Wildlife Acoustics, but it occurred to me that it was just possible they might not give me 10 SM4 bat FSs. So by chance, on the 9th of November 2018, I had a chat with Jack Merrifield at one of the Hampshire Bat Group's meetings. And he's talked to that group about his bat research down at Southampton University. And he said, well, why don't I have a talk to Andy Hill, who's the audio moth man, also based at Southampton University. So this is where it begins. So these are the people with audio moth. Andy's the guy with the disgracefully huge amount of hair compared to mine. In the middle, he's the electronics engineer who actually designed the audio moth. I should also thank Peter Prince because he's the main guy behind the firmware development. I've never quite worked out what Alex contributes, but there we go. So what is the audio moth? I know some of you are already using them, but it's essentially a low-cost open source acoustic recorder which runs on 3 AA batteries. I'm sure you're all familiar with EFM32 gecko processors, so we won't go into that. Now, the bits of the audio moth that matter to me are up the top left. That's where you put a micro SD card in. And just below that is a USB connection. And these do need to be configured, or used to, needed to be connected to a computer to configure them. On the right-hand side, we've got a switch. The first version, the switch stuck out and was very easily broken. But this next version, it's set in, so it's not so vulnerable. So this switches between the different modes, the most useful for me being off and custom. And this, amazingly, is the microphone down at the bottom right corner. These are MEMS microphones. It's a microelectronic device. I'm sure I should know what MEMS stands for, but there is a tiny microphone in there. And if you're wondering how the sound gets to it, well, there is a hole in the green circuit board, and the sound arrives from the other side of the circuit board through the hole to the microphone. Now, it's not quite like starting up an SM4 bat where you just open the case, you press the start button, close it, and off you go. Whenever you change the batteries on an audio moth, it forgets the date and the time. If it doesn't have the date and the time, it won't record anything. So there is an application you can use to set the date and the time. It's quite useful because it also shows you the firmware version you're using and gives an indication as to what the voltage of the battery is. But the other application which most people use enables you to configure the way that the audio moth works. And as bat people, you'll be familiar with the idea of things like sample rates. 192 kilohertz means you can record frequencies up to 96. It's half this number. But the problem is this is essentially a continuous recording approach. And I very soon worked out that 17 gigabytes of files for each night was not going to be practical. So we need another solution here. I was saying to Andy that for my project to be viable, I needed to be able to leave the audio moths out for at least 14 nights. And if I did that, my 3-month survey on the Isle of Wight would have required 6 sets of batteries and 7 visits. And I could just about do that. I couldn't go back there every other day. Essentially, it took the best part of a day for me to go around the island anyway. So the limitations are the capacity of the memory card and the battery power. So we can sort of stack the deck to give us the best possible chance. At that stage, I could get 64 gigabyte micro SD cards for about 17 quid each. But with that firmware, they had to be reformatted as FAT32. So that's another mistake that people can make. And Andy tipped me off to the fact that the Energizer lithium batteries are a lot more power dense than even Duracells. So they continue at a high voltage for much longer, which means that they, as the voltage drops, the device draws more and more current. So you end up in a death spiral. But that only happens after a long time with these batteries. So I basically said to Andy, what I need is something that lasts at least 14 nights using a 64 gigabyte card and Energizer lithium batteries. And bless him, before the end of January, he accepted the challenge, and he said that he would have a go at adapting the firmware that his colleague Peter had produced for a bat project in Cuba, and try and achieve what I needed with frequency triggered recordings. So at this stage, we've got probably 52 days before I'm trying to deploy these audio moths on the Isle of Wight. So why frequency triggered firmware? Basically, what uses the most power is writing files to the card and processing the sound data. So the trick is only to record when there is something worth recording. So if we have frequency triggered recordings, we only record when a bat flies by. Also, because we know we're starting the recording when the bat is approaching, we don't need to record very many seconds. I ended up settling on 10 seconds. And there's also the option of having a sleep between each sample. So I ended up using firmware that went to sleep for 2 seconds between each sample, which saved quite a lot of processing time. So batteries last longer, SD card feels slower. And because you haven't got so many gigabytes of data, it takes less time to copy the files from the card, and it uses less space on your hard drive, and it makes the painful business of processing the files a bit easier. So fewer, smaller files use less power. We ended up, I suggested, even though my objective was Nathusius Pipistrelles, so we could have probably said anything above 35 kilohertz, something like that. I thought if Andy's going to this much effort, it would be good if the firmware that comes out at the end of this is generally useful to most bat people. So I thought triggering if there are sounds above 18 kilohertz would make sense. The recordings are 10 seconds long, and I settled on the fairly modest sampling rate of 192 kilohertz, which means it's not quite high enough for lesser horseshoes, but amusingly, it still records lesser horseshoes. It's just the calls appear upside down just above 80, but that's another story. So the way that the triggering works is it samples the sound, it tests the sound to see if they're high frequencies. If there are, it records a file. Then it goes to sleep, and then it repeats. Andy showed me this. The orange is the power required to sample the sound. The magenta is the power required to test whether it's got high frequencies. The green is when it flashes the green LED. And then the blue is when it goes to sleep, when it uses almost no energy at all. So longer sleeping periods means more endurance. So while Andy was working on all that, there's another question with audio moths, and that is, how do you protect them? And different people have come up with different techniques. I have heard that those using the plastic bag often find the plastic bag full of water, which wasn't really the idea. I tried these. I ended up seeing what I could do with these electrical junction boxes. And this is my version. The foam pads make sure that the audio moth is located correctly so that the microphone coincides with the hole in the case. So it just nestles down like that. And the other key thing is, what do you put over the hole? And this is one of the Porel vents. I was the person to find these, actually. The audio moth guys, have been trying 5 or 6 other types. Now, the idea of the vent is it keeps the water out, but it lets the ultrasound through. But we'll find out it's not really quite that simple. So I've got a challenge. It's mid-February and I need to test bat detectors with real bats. So in the middle of February, where do you go? And for me, the answer is down very near that swarming site you described earlier. Down on Purbeck, we've got some greater horseshoe bat roosts, and they seem to be active pretty much all through the winter. And this is the typical spiraling flight of a greater horseshoe emerging. I've been pioneering high quality infrared video as well. So the other nice thing about this location is just in here to the right, there's a Myotis bat that lives up in the roof. And usually when I went down there, there would be a couple of common pipistrelles swirling around. So even in the middle of February, I had somewhere that I could test these things. So the first thing I did is I went down with, the main thing I'm trying to do here is to compare the different vents. and I've taken my SM4 BAT FS with me. I was also trying different gain settings, you know, how much to amplify the signal. But what's immediately apparent is there's a lot of this yellow color, which is bad. These are basically bats that the SM4 BAT has recorded, which the audio moths have not. So I knew I had some sort of problem. And the next night was even worse. In fact, I also set out another audio moth with cling film over the hole, and that was by far the best. SM4 BAT FS did really well. But by this time, I'm starting to realize that the Pipistrelles are generally okay with these vents, but the greater horseshoes up around 80 kilohertz, the high frequencies are rarely getting through these vents. So Andy sends me the first version of the new firmware, and it records nothing at all. 2 days later, he comes back with the next version of the triggered firmware, and I take it down to the greater horseshoe bats, and it's missing a lot of the calls. That was 21st of February. By the 26th of February, we're up to version 5. And this is not directly comparable. This is back at Longham Lakes where our story started. And there are no greater horseshoes here. So we're not confronted by greater horseshoe calls being missed. But if you look at this SM4 BAT FS and you compare it with what we got with the triggered audio moth, this audio moth with the grey vent is actually doing a little bit better than the SM4 BAT FS. Now, that's not necessarily typical. I did put them in a fairly noisy, busy corner. So it may be something as simple as maybe the SM4 BAT, maybe there's a short delay after it makes each recording or something like that. But the good news is by the time we get to this version of the firmware, as far as Nathusius Pipistrelles is concerned, I think we've got something we can use. So maybe I'll just let you look at this for a moment and ask if any of these things are of interest, please ask me about them. We settled on the 192 kilohertz sample rate, mostly because that's as high as you can sample with oversampling. Now, oversampling basically means it's taking 2 samples of a sound. So you get a better quality result because the sound is averaged. Yeah. 2 seconds sleep between samples. Yes, Andy suggested there's a limit of 150 files per hour, so that if you've got a very noisy night with lots of wind triggering ultrasound recordings, you won't fill your whole card. It'll only use up about 25 minutes in each hour. Okay. So before this little project, the Audio Moth really was a general purpose acoustic recorder, which if you used it for bats, you really couldn't leave it out for more than a night or two. After this project with Andy's new firmware, the Audio Moth plus the triggered firmware plus the enclosure and a suitable vent effectively becomes a static bat detector. And what I was finding by the end of my spring survey was that this setup would go on for in the end of May to June, so short nights, would go on for 30 nights or 15,000 files, whichever happened first. So any questions? That was the more technical Audio Moth bit. So if you've got more technical Audio Moth questions, this is one moment you might ask.
I certainly have. You mentioned you used the 50 kilohertz high pass. Now I've been setting them on 20 because I thought that was tuned into the bat echolocation frequency. So I guess I'm wrong there. So can you explain why it was 50 and how that works?
Okay, I think you're probably using the new firmware, which has some very different concepts in it. if you send me an email, I can send you a paper that describes how the new firmware works.
Okay,
But
thank you. Yeah.
basically, the new firmware is not frequency triggered, it's amplitude triggered. So it records loud things rather than high things. But you can then put a sort of soft filter on there, which will not reduce the high frequencies, but will reduce the lower frequencies. So the filter that you're using, it might mean that a barking dog is rather quieter, but if it's barking loud, it'll still record it because it's not frequency related on the new firmware.
Okay,
It's difficult. The new firmware really is quite alien. I've really had to try and understand it. And having understood it, I've gone back to using this experimental firmware that I've used for this Isle of Wight project, because I'm not happy with the new firmware, to be honest.
Right.
One of the ulterior motives I have for doing these talks is I'm half hoping you're going to say to me, well, could I send you the frequency triggered firmware? And then if enough people like it, I hope that Andy and the AudioMoth team will actually pursue proper BAT frequency triggered firmware, which they're not doing at the moment. But there we are.
I would be very happy to try that because I've got 5 or 6 out at the moment, and I am finding I'm getting a lot of tawny owls, a lot of wrens, robins, dunnocks, sort of in the lead up to sunrise. So anything that eliminates those, because I'm not finding I'm getting anywhere near like 14 nights out of them.
Well, no.
Yeah, so that would, I would be really interested in trying that if that's possible to do.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Get in touch with me. I've got a light reflector here. I can't see what you can see, but everything's rolling out of place. Anyway, I'm back. Okay, any other questions about the AudioMoth end of things? So we can come back to it at the end anyway.
There's nothing else in the chat at the moment.
Okay,
so.
thank you very much.
Okay.
So here we go. We've got some devices we can actually deploy on the Isle of Wight. So here we are, Freshwater Bay. There's one up there on the Outdoor Activity Centre. And this is a fisheye shot, which gives you an idea of what that detector can see. This is the back of the beach. So any bats coming in here, the idea is that they'll fly over in this direction. So I'll just show you, I think this is the best of all the locations. This is a boathouse, so that somebody can conveniently launch his boat. And one of the things you may start to realize is these enclosures that I'm using, which are little electrical junction boxes, just look very much at home on any man-made structures. I mean, people are walking up and down past there every day in numbers, but I'd be absolutely amazed if any of them even noticed that. So that one has this view back along the coast here. So you can visualize if we've got Nathusius Pipistrelles following this coast along, they're probably going to fly past quite close to. So that's, now this is even more public. This is Fort Victoria along here. This is owned by the council. And this has always got people walking up and down with dogs and things. So in this case, I put some camouflage tape on the front of the box and used 2 small screws to attach it to the tree, and then just dragged a bit of ivy over it, and very difficult to see. Here we're over at Brading. This is quite a wide valley, so it's optimistic just putting one bat detector there. This is in the center of the island. This is a wonderful triangular field. It's very wide at that end, and this end it comes down to almost nothing. And this is the stream that runs through here. So if anything is coming up from the south, I'm reckoning it might enter this field and end up just coming past me here. This is actually where I got the recordings for the Greater Horseshoe. And then things got a lot more complicated. Alastair Davies has worked very closely with the AudioMoth team, trying to promote the use of open hardware, open source hardware in conservation. And Alastair says to me, would I like another 20 AudioMoths for my project? And of course, the answer is yes, please. So at that stage, we are able to extend the survey. And So the plan was to extend it through the Channel Islands and onto the French coast, which was what we actually achieved. And I'll just point out now that if you've got bats going in this direction, Guernsey is really quite a good shape in terms of funneling bats to the end and then off. I've complained to the people on Jersey that Jersey is pretty rubbish shape, because where do you put your bat detector along that coast? But okay, getting ahead of ourselves. I'm particularly impressed by this location here, the Sillon de Talbert, or something like that. So if you're migrating along this coast, when you get to this point, you either have to go off in the wrong direction, or you might think, well, bother it, let's just go for it. So I'm thinking that if we find a bat at the end of this 3 kilometer long spit, what the heck's it doing there? And there's a fairly good chance it might be there because it's migrating through. So we ran one at the visitor center and one, well, at the visitor center and one at the end here. They always put a fence out to go around the ring plover nests. So I thought that was just about a perfect location, which I hope to visit one day. But of course, now I've got other people trying to follow the same procedure that I'm following, and that means I've got to write it all down and try and explain it, and in French. Thankfully, I got some help with the French translation. So this tells them what to do with their piles. So, okay. We've just got to think about what we can discover and what we can't. So my basic starting point is that the number of files per night is a measure of activity, and that peaks in activity level may indicate migration. So if I've got one audio moth, I have fairly low confidence. It might just have been a night with a lot of insects around the bat detector. But if I've got what I call a swarm of audio moths spread across a landscape, if I'm getting peaks of activity at multiple locations, then I think we have rather more confidence that this is going to be due to migration rather than local effects. What about local resident populations? As we found earlier, that can be a problem too. But my hope is that significant peaks in activity should still stand out above the normal background activity. But that's one of the reasons I always try and start these surveys early and carry on late. So I do literally try and keep the surveys going for a full 3 months, so that we discover what is happening before the migration and what's happening after the migration. Now I'm dealing with huge numbers of files here. So what happens if I don't identify them all correctly? And that's inevitably the case. But this is a numbers game. It's not like a commercial bat survey where you need to work out what that call is. In this case, as long as we've got the vast majority of the calls correctly identified, we should still see the patterns. Oh yes, the point there at the bottom. I'm fairly sure I'm starting to get Cool's Pipistrelles down here on a fairly regular basis. Now in Brittany, they're the second most common Pipistrelle. So this is hardly surprising, but because it's almost impossible to tell the two apart from ultrasound, if the Cool's Pipistrelle numbers do build up here, that's going to make it very difficult for me to continue these surveys. And what about the weather? What about the weather? Well, as you saw from the Abbotsbury charts, there are breaks in the activity. So one of the things I've tried to do is to compare the number of files per hour, where sunset is at the beginning of hour 0, and then sunrise is over here. So this is a pattern of the activity each hour after sunset, and to the right I've worked out, using my schoolboy trigonometry, the headwind, which seems to be what matters. And I think I got it right that this is in kilometers per hour. But you can see I've colored it so that a strong headwind shows as red and a tailwind shows as green. So you've got situations here where there are adverse winds and there's almost no activity coming past the bat detector. You've got other nights like this where it's really good conditions. These are interesting because this starts off with favorable conditions and then gets worse. And if you look at the files per hour, it starts off with a decent number of files and then it just evaporates. Whereas the 12th of September, it's the other way around, it starts off with adverse conditions and then gets more favorable. And so we're getting this pattern here as well. So weather does have an effect on the migration. My guess is what happens. These bats probably progress in dribs and drabs along a coast, and they'll stop for a night. And when they get up the next evening, they probably feed, and then they basically, if the conditions are good, they'll probably proceed, and if they're not good, they'll probably stay locally for a while. So I think you probably find they get bottled up. Is it a bit like rounders, I think, where when the conditions are good, you clear the bases and everybody gets back or moves on? Not that I really understand the sport, but anyway, so weather is going to have an effect as well. So how did we do? This is a very simple way of looking at it. I've simply added together the number of files from each of these locations on the Isle of Wight for each night. And the first thing you'll notice is that there are two distinct peaks. And the second thing you might notice is they're different colors. So that means activity in different parts of the island. So the first activity is the 19th to the 19th to the 23rd of April. And this year, Martin Cade contacted me to say he'd actually watched a bat fly in from over the sea on the 19th of April. So that ties in exactly with this peak that we're getting on the Isle of Wight. So that was at the Portland Bird Observatory. So when you look at where the activity was spread across the island, there's quite a lot down in the south of the island. There's very little here. And this is where you might expect quite a lot of activity if the bats are coming in from the west, but there's nothing there to show it. You can see the way it's peaking as well. There are some little subtleties here, like the main activity is on Compton Farm there, which is the orange, and there's still good activity here. Now, I'm now thinking of this as a way out of the island down through Brading Marshes. And I was amused when I added this little chart to the map. I was amused to see that it almost alternates. You get a lot of activity here, and then the next night you get activity there. It doesn't always work. But again, looking at this chart, you don't really get a lot of activity in these two places at the same time. So it's almost hinting that they arrive from somewhere and then they probably hang around for the rest of that night, and then maybe they leave the next night. But there's an awful lot of guesswork involved in this, as you'll appreciate. Just finding my way, really. So if we look at the second peak, it's amazingly late, 28th of May to the 3rd of June. It's not like any bird migration I'm aware of, but there's an awful lot of activity going on. And it's going along here. So almost all this activity is along the Solent. And I'm very confident that this is probably coming in from the West Country. If you look at the south of the island, there's very little going on down here. There's a little bit, but it's not like before. So lots of activity up this coast. So just to compare the two, the mid-April, there's atypically large levels of activity here. The end of May, you've got almost all the activity up here. And again, I can start looking at this, looking at the time of night that this activity was happening. And I've just picked this splurge at the end of May for you. Fort Victoria is the one here. So Fort Victoria Now, what caught my eye with this, when I do this normally, I'm used to getting most of the activity early in the evening and then dribs and drabs later on. Whereas here, most of the activity is quite late, really. And to me, that's also true up at Gurnard. This just sort of hints at the idea that, well, maybe the bats have been on the wing and they've already done quite a lot this evening before they got to this place. So it's not as if they were roosting locally and passing the detector soon after sunset. I think these bats have probably already traveled quite a long way. So let's just have a look at Guernsey. What I've done is I've put these yellow bands on here to remind you when the main activity was happening on the Isle of Wight. Now, it's not quite the same on Guernsey. There's nothing really distinct in April. There is some activity, but it's very sporadic. By the time we get to early May, there's some quite concentrated activity over a few nights. And we've got another block of activity in mid-May. And then they do have a lot of activity at the end of May, but it's later than the activity on the Isle of Wight. It's all shifted forward shifted back 3 nights. So it's happening 3 nights later in Guernsey than it was on the Isle of Wight. I hope you're not going to ask me the reason for this. Now, if we look at Brittany, the biggest disappointment for me was due to various misunderstandings and mishaps, the most interesting location at the end of the Ceylon to Telbear, I only had a brief window of data for. I could tell you all about it, but it's just a sad story. Okay, we've still got this mid-April peak on the Isle of Wight, and on the Brittany coast they've got something very like this. In fact, theirs seems to start rather earlier. There's no real correlation with this early May peak on Guernsey. That doesn't seem to be echoed on the Brittany coast, but this mid-May does echo on the Brittany coast. So maybe some of those bats we were seeing on Guernsey, maybe they were coming up through this part of Brittany, I'm guessing. Similarly, down here, at the end of May, the pattern on the Brittany coast is very much like the blue band here, which is Guernsey. So as I usually find with these things, I start off with a question and I end up with lots of questions. But it definitely feels to me like there are 2 surges of activity up round the Isle of Wight. Mid-April seems to be coming in from the south, probably from the Channel Islands and Brittany. The end of May, why is it so late? The end of May seems to be much more intense activity through the Solent. Answers on a postcard, please. And, you know, I said I was getting good endurance from these audio moths. I actually left them out at the end of the survey for 30 nights. Maybe it should have been 40 nights in the wilderness, but I left them out for 30 nights. And at the end of that, out of the 10 of them, only 3 had run out of battery power, but those had already collected pretty much 15,000 files. The others were still going strong after 30 nights. Andy did mention that based on his calculations, he anticipated that the Energizer lithium would last 18 nights and that Duracells would last 8 nights. So that gives you a sense of how much better the Energizer lithium batteries are. So Whitelink gave me free ferry travel, which is very good because it's about 70 quid return each time. And I wrote them a nice article about Nathusius Pipistrelles, which got into the Isle of Wight newspaper. So all the locals know a bit more about bats. The most special seasonal visitor was about the bats rather than about me. So good point just to take a breath And if you've got some questions you'd like to ask at that stage, I've got more for you to tell you, for example, what happened the following year. But any questions now on this?
I was just wondering, Adrian, if in all your recorded files, have you identified that any of them have got foraging activity around them, or is it just passes?
So some of them no doubt have foraging activity that it's a matter of time. I could go through them individually and try and work out which ones are simple passes and which ones are more than that. I'm sure you're right that some of these do include foraging activity, and that if I took that out, it would affect the pattern. But I'm confident that the underlying pattern with the two peaks would still be there.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Do you know if there's any known maternity roosts in Dorset or along that part of the south coast? Could they be travelling into the area to breed?
I was wondering that also, because
yes.
especially the 30th of May recordings to the sort of to June really would, they are already forming maternity roosts. And
well, these, okay, the first story I told you was about Chesil Beach, and I think there is a resident population there. But when you're looking at the Isle of Wight, you're talking about going from sort of basically no resident population that I can determine to having a lot of activity at the end of May, and then it drops away again. So it does feel to me like that they are passing through the area. They're not staying in the area. I mean, I almost wonder whether there might be something to do with whether it's males or females. I mean, I could almost imagine that maybe the females become receptive, I don't know, in June or something, and maybe there's no point the males getting back any earlier than when they can mate with the females. But I'm just making this all up, trying to think of some sensible reason.
I'm trying to think of any large bodies of water as well on the Isle of Wight, apart from the river, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, still bodies, which I'm having trouble with now. I know the Isle of Wight quite well. I have quite a lot of family there.
Yeah. There are very, I mean, like
they're very few, aren't there?
Yeah. I mean, you've got quite a suitable area up on the north coast. What do they call it? It's a national nature reserve, which is good for birds, estuary, and I suppose you've got freshwater bay. But I mean, we were getting the same rush at the end of May on Abbotsbury as well, in the previous year, if you remember, and that happened a bit after those 3 bat detectors showed a peak on the Isle of Wight. In my bones, I don't think it's to do with breeding activity. I think it is migration, and I think they're going somewhere. But what I'm starting to find is because I'm starting to fill in some of the details, it's suggesting some really interesting questions that we need to answer. And I'm starting to think, I've been talking to people about whether we could create what I call pop-up motus stations, maybe a small low-cost omnidirectional motus unit that apparently only cost a few £100s. So if you had something small you could put in the boot of your car and take to somebody's back garden and just set up and leave running for a few months, I may be finding some places where it would be worth doing that, in conjunction with some tagging, of course. So yeah, so I mean, there are definitely some target areas I'd love to check. It's so difficult to draw for any firm conclusions from this.
We know about that.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking earlier, if you talk to bird watchers about bird migration, you know, if you go down during the spring migration to Portland Bill, you'll find loads of bird watchers mooching around there, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, there's been a migration of wheatears. They're all over the place." And I'm thinking to myself, instead of birds, read bats, and instead of bird watchers, read static bat detectors. And I think in much the same way that those bird watchers have just noticed that all of a sudden there was a lot of wheatears. I think our bat detectors are seeing it rather similarly. They're just noticing that for a period of time, there are a lot of Nathusius pips around. The bird watchers are happy to conclude that that means migration, but we feel much more cautious about this because we've never really thought of it this way before. So, I mean, I am actually starting to think of acoustic surveys as a way of focusing the other ways of studying migrating bats, such as motus. So maybe I can discover where the radio stations need to target to answer the questions. Anyway, any more questions now, or shall I move on?
There is somebody typing right at the moment.
Ooh, that's
No pressure.
exciting.
Oh.
There
There
is
are
one
a couple
about
of-
the GPS, Tina.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a couple of audio moth questions, but whether we want to save those and go back to them at the end, or whether you'd like to do those.
Maybe we could save them. I guess we've sort of got past that bit almost.
So the hot off the press question is, which software are you using to analyze the calls, or are you still doing them manually?
We need to come back to that at the end, otherwise
Okay.
I'm going to get derailed.
Yeah, no, we can make a list of things at the end,
Yes,
no problem.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just move on then.
Okay.
Right. So another year. I didn't realize how complicated it was going to get. But the aim now is to do it all again and do it better. So my theory has changed a bit now, in that there was absolutely no indication of bats passing up through the valleys from the south of the island to the north of the island, even though I monitored two likely places, one here and one here. So I was now thinking that most of the bats arriving on the south of the island would probably just follow the features and head out through the breeding marshes. So I've sort of redesigned a little bit. And I've also got this nagging doubt about these orange arrows on the left, because if you look at where Old Harry Rocks and Purbeck is, this would be the direction from which bats from Purbeck might arrive. So that sort of confuses things a bit. So some improvements. I want my audio moth to be more sensitive, because I want them to have greater range. Because if I've got an audio moth set up and it only records, I don't know, 20-meter radius, I'd rather it recorded 30-meter radius or 40-meter radius. So what can I do to improve the performance? And one of the things I started experimenting with, do you remember people having trouble with wildlife acoustics SMMU2 microphones with birds pecking through the membranes? And what they did is they sent out some little metal mesh patches that you could put over the sensitive vent. And they said, no, that won't have any effect on the ultrasound. So I thought, for my audio moths, why don't I try stainless steel mesh? And having run them under the tap and done various experiments, I found out that I can make them a bit more water resistant by treating them with nick wax. But the difference, yes, this is my current design. So I've got 500 threads per inch mesh over the hole, and then I've got a flap of coarser mesh over that. And the idea is to take the sting out of any really high energy drops, so that all that reaches this hole here is just sort of spray. But that's the design at the moment. And side-by-side testing, two audio moths. This top left audio moth had the Pipistrelle grey vent, and the one at the bottom right had the mesh. And you can see it's profoundly different for this soprano pipistrelle. I'm getting much stronger signals with the mesh than I did with the Pipistrelle vent. And to be honest, this doesn't surprise me, because most of the vents are like Gore-Tex, and it occurred to me that the only way that sound is going to reach the microphone is if that Gore-Tex membrane vibrates. Whereas with the stainless steel mesh, it's actually got holes in the mesh, And I think what happens, the sound wave arrives at the hole and punches through. The energy goes through the hole and energizes the air on the inside. If you imagine a load of railings, sort of park railings, stuck in the edge of a pond, the little waves and ripples will go straight between them. And I think that's what's happening with the mesh. So I can increase the range of my audio moths by using mesh vents. And the other thing I wanted to start doing is using screens of multiple detectors, because I have to accept that one detector only has a certain reach. So why not use multiple detectors? They don't cost all that much. So that's what we did up at Fishbourne and also down at Brading. Now, this was actually slightly more fraught than I expected. I had help from a guy called Dave Moore, and brilliant guy, he drove wooden posts into this shingle bank here on which to mount the audio moths. And soon after I left him with 4 audio moths, he sent me an email saying that I would be pleased to hear that the recent exceptionally high tide had not reached the top of these posts. Then I looked back at Google Maps and they'd updated the mapping. So I then got a better idea of what we'd actually let ourselves in for. Remarkably, all these audio moths survived the ordeal. But look, this is the 2020 graph. And you're going to say, but that's nothing like what you had before. And you're right. And initially I was disappointed. But then I thought, well, maybe this is the most important thing I've discovered so far, because at the back of all this is the underlying question: do these bats follow traditional routes or habitual routes, or do they wing it? And just comparing these 2 years, I put my money on the fact that they just wing it, by which I mean they vary their route depending on the conditions and the circumstances each year. That's quite important when you start thinking about conservation. If you think about things like wading birds, we know some of these species have traditional routes, so we can do something to protect the marshes that they use along their route. But if these bats take a different route every year, we can't really conserve the resources that they use while they're on migration. And it also means that there is no right place to put a wind farm, because they might change their route. They might miss the wind farm 4 years and go straight through it on the 5th. So anyway, let's see where this activity was. So we do have a lot of activity in the middle of April, as before. And that happened here, same place as the previous year. In fact, I'm running 2 audio moths here. The one by the road was almost taken out by a crashed car, but that went through about 3 posts further along. Apparently it happens every year. But when you look at where this is, we're looking almost east here. So bats coming in from Channel Islands might come in like this. Bats coming in from Purbeck might come in like that. And between this cliff on your left and the Needles is almost all cliff. So this is almost like one of the first places you might be able to go ashore. So it doesn't surprise me that this is an area with a lot of activity. And this is a location where I'm fairly certain if I check the files, I probably would find a lot of foraging activity. And it might also be interesting to ask Anna, the farmer, whether her cattle were in there on those nights, but that's another question. Okay. But so we're getting a similar mid-April pattern as last time. If we look at most of these, it's not just late May this time, it's from middle of May through into June. And I've just cut this down to the sort of exit routes. And if we look at that, most of this activity is actually through Brading Marsh. This year I ran 3 audio moths across the valley there because it's quite wide, and I just had 1 down there. So this does feel like sort of what I was expecting. So this is how it works. This is the sort of lay of the land: flat valley, steep hill this side as well. So you can imagine if they're following this river down, because it's easy following a valley, this would be a great way out and off to the Sussex coast. I'm trying to remember what I put into the presentation next, but we'll find out. Okay. Now I've been using this idea of using multiple detectors rather than a single detector. So I thought I should try that going back to Chesil Beach. So this last autumn, I ran detectors at Abbotsbury, at West Bexington, and at Hythe Beach. And it's about 8 kilometers along here. You can also see there's high ground to the right. And where we are at the front of the picture here, it's about 200 meters off to the right. That drops down gradually, but this section of beach is almost isolated from the inland areas in that it's almost like a self-contained system. It's unlikely that bats are joining from the sea. And I don't know how often they'll bother to come down to the beach. So it should be almost a sort of flight path along here. So those are the locations, and that's the scale. So it's quite a large scale thing, really. And the results, just very briefly, this is total number of files again. Abbotsbury has the huge advantage that it has that narrow valley at the back of the beach, whereas as you move west to West Bexington, the landscape is much, much wider and less well defined. So the bats have so much more choice as to whether they go along the front of the beach or a couple of 100 meters inland. But what I was pleased to see is we are getting repeating patterns. So we're getting, I mean, this is the main surge, as you might expect in the middle of September. We are getting more at Abbotsbury, but we're getting echoes of this at West Bexington and along at Hythe Beach. Same's happening here. And also in October, similar pattern. And then right at the end, there's a little bit of activity late October, and there are echoes of it along the beach. So I wanted to try this because if you run a single detector in a place like this, you may well be put off by foraging activity, confusing the pattern, and a single detector has no sense of movement, whereas we've got 3 detectors spread out over 8 kilometers here, and we're getting a sort of pattern of movement along the beach. It's not conclusive, but I think it's much more persuasive seeing a pattern repeating along such a long bit of coastline. And we're almost there now. I'll stop in a minute. Now, if you've got 20, 25 bat detectors out for 3 months, twice a year, you're quite likely to come across things that other people don't seem to be finding. So I think I'm finding what's probably cools quite often. The grid lines here are at 40 and 35. So you've got low pipistrelle calls with good FM tails right down at about 36. So it is very difficult and it's not conclusive. But this one stopped me. Here we've got pipistrelle type calls, and we've got constant frequency calls at about 30, 31. No, it's about 31. And then the ones with the tails on the chirps, they're up around 32. And I've asked various experts, is this a Savvy's pipistrelle? And all the people are saying to me, well, it doesn't look like a UK bat. It is a very good match for Savvy's, but maybe it's another species doing something unexpected. But I did, by chance, find Primoz Przetnek, who tells me by us, Slovenia, I would classify them as H. savvii, as they're common here. But I tried to be careful in your case. in look what other possibilities are. And his English is so much better than my Slovenian. So there's stuff going on out there, and not many people are looking at it. Nick Knight of the Hampshire Bat Group contacted the DNA lab that they use, and he discovered that the lab didn't even test for these species. So if you had some Savi's Pipistrelle poo in a sample and you sent it in, it would just come back probably as Pipistrelle spe. So there are many reasons, even if these bats are found from time to time along the south coast, there are many reasons why nobody would notice. And there we go, that's the end.
Thank you, that's fantastic.
Now, how do I?
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, we've gone back to the screen. So we've got 2 or 3 different questions for you.
Okay.
Shall we start at the top and work down? So going back to the audio moth
Yes.
questions, have you tried to add a GPS?
I haven't tried to add a GPS, and I'm not really too bothered. Sorry to sound dismissive. The frequency triggered firmware that I've been using for these projects automatically does the sunrise and sunset times for Alderney on the version that I use, and there's a more general version, 1.0.9, which is based on Southampton. And having checked the way that sunset and sunrise changes as you move around Great Britain, I'm fairly happy that anybody in Scotland or in Cornwall or in Norfolk, those settings will be adequate. And the main reason is because it starts half an hour before sunset and finishes half an hour after sunrise. And that's probably, I mean, as you go north, for you, it might be 40 minutes before sunset and so on, but that doesn't matter really. So I haven't tried it with the GPS, and I'm very lucky that this firmware has got the automatic start and stop times, and they serve my purpose very well. So it's not something I've explored.
No, I think knowing who's asked this question and having been out with her husband on a bike with an audio moth and us following in a car with a
right.
and a bat out the window trying to do compared driven and cycle transects.
Right.
This question's more about looking at where it is rather than sunset, sunrise times. So obviously it's different application. But
yes, sorry about
worth
that.
asking the question.
Yes, definitely. Sorry, I waffled on so long.
No, not at all. But no, we've had Neil out on his bike with anabats and audio moths strapped to him on a few occasions now.
Brilliant.
Right. So our next question, we'll go back to the software. So how do you analyze your calls? Because obviously you're dealing with a huge volume of data.
I am. I can come back from my 18 audio moths on the Isle of Wight with about a terabyte. So the first thing that I do is I do tend to use Kaleidoscope. And one of the things that you get free in Kaleidoscope is the file converter. So you can use the file conversion, and I convert everything to W4V files, which are compressed. So that immediately saves me half the space. I haven't noticed any difference in the quality, but of course, that's not an option for people that don't like to use Kaleidoscope. But the point is that when you do the file conversion, you can tell it to throw away all the files that it doesn't think include bat calls. And weirdly, you can convert from WAV to WAV. So I often find that once I run it through that process, I've got rid of 90% of the files, because audio moth triggering is primitive compared with SM4 bat. So things like vegetation, rustling, you're going to get a lot more false recordings. So my first step then is to knock out all or most of the noise files. I'm paying for a Kaleidoscope Pro license. So I would then run Kaleidoscope Pro over it. And that means that I can look at the interesting files. I don't have to go all the way through the common Pipistrelle files. And I can go through them manually, essentially. So that's my general approach to analysing audio moth files.
That's still going to take a huge amount of time, even with just knocking all the non-bats out to start with. That's really quite impressive, knowing how long it takes. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And the other question is, it says the charts you've made are very detailed. Could the migration coincide with the moon? Is it easier to make the journey with the full moon?
I wonder. That's something I should check. I suppose my initial reaction is probably not, because, well, I'm just trying to remember, how much does the cycle of the moon change from year to year? Does anybody know that? I mean, if I said mid-April, are you going to tell me that's always a full moon?
No, it's not.
No,
because you get effectively 13 moons in 12 months. So there will be a pattern, but it's not a stable pattern. Yeah.
No, well, in that case, I don't think that theory works, because I am getting surges at I mean, I've been surveying on Abbotsbury for 3 or 4 years now, and it's always mid-September in the autumn. And what I'm getting in the spring is always mid-April and always late May. So it wouldn't fall like that if it was moon related, I think.
And
interesting idea.
Related to that, have you looked at any of the data from, say, Portland to see if you've got bird migrations on the same nights? You know, if the weather conditions were favourable for, you know, the warblers coming over, that would work more in April than later on, admittedly.
Yes.
But
yes. And I mean, Portland is a spring migration centre rather than an autumn migration centre. It's interesting. I was just swapping WhatsApps with Martin Cade on this subject this afternoon, and we've just sort of realised that maybe there is some sort of link, but we haven't explored it yet.
It does just make you wonder if suddenly, when all the birds pile over, if that means the conditions are favourable, so the bats are moving at the same time.
Absolutely. It was interesting, Martin talking about the bat that he saw in April 2019, because he was actually the observer. I mean, these places are amazing in that they're covered in bird watchers with big telescopes. So if you want somebody to spot a bat flying in off the sea, this is exactly the place, isn't it? But Martin was saying that what caught his attention was that it was jinking about in a very erratic way as it flew in over the sea. And that's what caught his attention. And then he watched it as it approached, and it actually passed to the west of Portland, about as high as the top of Pulpit Rock, which some of you might know is the big sort of pillar that's on the shore on that side. But I wonder whether it's jinking around because it was in daylight and it's probably feeling very vulnerable to attack from gulls and things. So I guess bats probably don't have much eyesight pointing backwards. It's mostly forward and sideways. So I wonder whether it's like, you know, a World War II fighter pilot always changing his direction.
One of our very early Nathusius records in Northumberland was a bat seen flying in off the sea. Hazel, do you remember the dates of that? I know it was September, wasn't it?
September, because it was, wasn't it the same weekend as the bat conference?
Yeah, none of us were there. Yeah. None of us.
Typical. But it was something like the 11th of September, I think.
Okay.
Somewhere around then.
That's very plausible. Yeah. I was thinking with your coast, I had a quick look at the topography, and I was hoping that I might find places where bats would be funneled as they move along your coast. And I didn't feel inspired by what I saw. Like, the question for you is, where would you put your detectors to pick up this movement?
Well, we have had them on the Farne Islands.
Right. What did you get?
Yes, same pattern, September being a peak.
Right.
So I have all that data from two years worth. I couldn't do it, unfortunately, last year because of the pandemic. Yeah. We weren't allowed to land on the island, but I have it on the tower on Inner Farne, and surprisingly, you know, we do get quite a few bat passes. You wouldn't think so, would you, far offshore? Yeah. But that does correlate quite well.
One of the things that interests me is if you've got a bat at night flying across the channel towards the Dorset coast, would they be able to home in on something like Portland Bill? like, would they be able to hear it from several kilometers away, or would they have good enough eyesight to see it in moonlight or starlight? I'm just wondering whether they will converge on a point when they're arriving, or whether they're just going to be coming ashore all along our coast.
I think somebody said to me once that they would head for lights.
Okay.
So this was an old colleague of mine from Hertfordshire, and she was doing some studying about Nathusius, and she was saying that they head for river estuaries often, which have got lights on either side.
Oh, right.
But that's a bit anecdotal.
Yeah, so they look red on the left and green on the right.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and maybe lighthouses flashing. You know, they would head towards maybe some light, to guide them to land.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I mean, the question in my mind is if they're not drawn strongly to somewhere like Portland Bill, then what we see on Portland Bill is only a tiny fraction of the bats that are coming in. And
the Dungeness, when they were trapping there, they got huge numbers on one night. When they trapped, I've forgotten what that was. Was that set? No, that was a bit later, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
October.
Was it October?
18, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's entirely plausible.
Absolutely huge numbers. I mean, we had our sort of 5 that we caught off our coast, you know, and we were really pleased with that. And then we looked at theirs, and they were like, you know, can't remember what they were now, 30 or 40, something ridiculous. We're like, oh, great.
Yeah. Well, it's all part of the picture, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
But that's something that late at Dungeness also ties in with me at Abbotsbury, getting them through as late as the beginning of November. And also the fact that those late ones are inevitably heading west. They're not mooching about. They're just going.
Yeah, I mean, they do cover a huge distance in a fairly short space of time from work that's been done with these bats that have been found in different places, either having left us or we've caught them here. Yes. And they kind of covered a huge amount of ground in quite a short space of time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that interests me with this idea of small omnidirectional motor stations, they probably only cost a few £100s to set up, and they have a limited range. It's like 1 kilometre. But if you think of that last section where I was talking about the 3 locations on Chesil Beach, you could have Nick Tomlinson and his nets down at Abbotsbury using that 100-metre width area that they tend to come through. You could have a pop-up motor station at West Bexington, another one up at Hythe Beach. And you could almost have Nick releasing them at Abbotsbury and seeing if they then pass through the other 2 points.
Be interesting.
It would.
Yes, I think the this pop-up motors thing sounds quite interesting, because we have toyed with the idea on this coast because they do it in the Netherlands. You know, sort of coming in, we would be able to pick that up maybe on some of the, say, like the Blythe or New Biggin, you know, the jutty out bits.
Yes, jutty out bits are good.
We like jutty out bits.
Well, I was sort of looking down, what's it, around the Humber, there's that long promontory that goes north-south, isn't there? What's it called? At the end of that would be interesting. Yeah, it's too far from me.
Yeah, a bit far from us, really.
yes, I know.
Well, Claire suggested that we should do a Durham-Northumberland collaboration on the mouth of the Tyne and see if they're coming in there.
Yeah.
Well,
we have got some records, haven't we, at Ousburn? So
it's probably our biggest history as well.
Yeah.
Well, with Audiomoth, you've got the capability of setting out large numbers of them to try and cover more of the countryside. You could, you could try and set them up like a line across their flight path. If you had, even if you had 10 spread out across a kilometre or something, you'd get quite a few of the ones coming in.
Another project.
Yes, endless projects.
Keep you out of mischief, Hazel.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I'd like to be doing any projects at the moment.
Yeah,
that would be nice.
I had a real challenge trying to keep the spring 2020 survey on the Isle of Wight going.
You did well.
Well, the first blow was that Whitelink said they couldn't, in all honesty, give me free travel because the government had asked them to provide transport for emergency, for priority traffic. And they couldn't argue that that was me. So I ended up having to persuade myself that it was work that I couldn't do from home, drive all the way around to Portsmouth, which by then was the only ferry working to the island, and pay all my own fares. But at least by then I'd worked out the audio moths could last for at least 21 nights. So I think I did it in 5 visits rather than 7.
Not bad.
No, it's okay. Anything else?
I think that's covered all the questions that have come in so far.
Okay.
I don't know whether you can see the chat, but there's a lot of people saying thank you and how interesting the talk has been, which is really nice to know. So I've certainly learned a lot. We've given Hazel another project to add to her portfolio, whether she wants one or not.
Yes. Yeah. I think the main thing I'd say is just sort of keep this in mind. It's been suggested to me, Fiona Matthews, that there may be a lot more migration going on than any of us think. She was suggesting common pipistrelle. So we need to keep open minds. And
I've certainly had nocture coming over the farms.
Yes.
So you're right. We don't know the half of it, do we really?
No, absolutely not.
Which is why it's interesting.
It is, but also it does occur to me that most of the people that own static bat detectors are probably ecologists, and they start putting them out, I don't know, maybe early May. By the end of September, they're so fed up with bats, I think they put them in the cupboard. So I'd say don't put them in the cupboard, put them out somewhere, even in winter. Yes, that's right.
Give us to the poor lowly volunteers. That's what people have.
Adrian, quick question for you. I'm doing a sort of project at the moment, and I'm collecting as much data as I can, trying to see if there's any evidence of bats migrating from the UK over to Ireland.
Oh, right.
So I've been in contact with all the bat groups around the Irish Sea, finding out if there's any data or information. I'm just looking for a contact in the Nathusius project, but I can email you separately about that. I know they've had some recorders out, and just how viable it is to come out with a theory, and it obviously shown by your talk tonight. You ask 1 or 2 questions and you do a survey strategy you think is going to answer it, and then all of a sudden you've got 27 more questions that need answering.
Which all that really proves is that it's a subject that needs studying, and we know amazingly little about it.
Yeah.
Why would they be going between the 2 countries?
The only thing I could think of would be for sort of the need to spread genetics, really. And they know they've got Nathusius in Ireland. They've got Liselers, but not noctule, which is just strange.
Weird.
And the odd one has turned up on the shore. I mean, they've had a greater horseshoe land sort of on the shore at one point. So things are crossing.
Yes.
Whether they just decide they have to leave Wales and they're a bit confused directionally, I don't know.
Yeah. I'd be looking at points that they might be leaving, like what I call the Lynn Peninsula, which apparently means in Welsh the peninsula.
It's a great diving destination.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean that's a nice pointy bit. Look out for pointy bits. And
Stranraer, because Stranraer is about the absolute closest point to Ireland across there. It's not very far. So
no, it's interesting.
So I'm hoping to get that off the ground a bit.
Yeah.
Do you have a contact in the Isle of Man, maybe?
I do, yes.
That's good.
That might help.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll see how that one goes.
Yes. I'd be interested to hear how it goes.
Contacting all the bat groups, which are all very, very different, was also quite interesting. Some are extremely organized and got straight back to me with rafts of data. Others were like, we don't know, we don't hold data, you need to contact X. It's been quite interesting because every time you contact a back group and see how they work, you apply it to your own and think, right, what could we do better, or are we doing better, and so on. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
Yes, that's good. One of the things that worries me, this idea of bats coming across from France, the Channel Islands, to the Isle of Wight. Why are they going in that direction? And it did occur to me that maybe it's a population that then heads cross country to your patch and over to Norway or whatever. I mean, if they were heading for Poland, they've gone the wrong way if they're coming across the channel.
Who knows?
Not me.
I wish we could ask them. Be a lot easier.
Yes. Yeah.
Bro, I'm going to stop recording if that's all right. I can work out it.
Oh, that's really good though. Giving us lots more to think about.
Yes. Not many answers.
No. Well, there we are. That's what we like.
Yes, good.
Well, that's bats, isn't it? Just
Yeah,
ask a question
exactly.
and get more answers.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. That's been really, really good talk.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I'll do it for